Hello, welcome to my slideshow presentation over deductive reasoning. When you're looking at deduction, these are principles that are used to infer unstated conclusion about specific information. When we get to the examples, I think it'll make more sense. If you haven't looked at my inductive presentation yet, I suggest you do that one first and then deduction. It's a little easier to understand. So as you did your inductive information, you didn't have all the information, but you reached the best conclusion you could based on the information that you had. Now you're going to deduce from there. So in some ways, you've done the induction and you come up with a premise. So polar bears are white. That's a good major premise. Paul's a polar bear. Therefore, Paul is white. That would be your deductive conclusion. So that major premise, polar bears are white, is going to lead to Paul the polar bear being white. So you have deduced things. This is called a syllogism. A couple of slides. We'll get into that. So let's say, heaven forbid, a super Walmart is going up across the street from you. Well, you can pretty much predict what's going to be in that Walmart. Interesting characters, for certain, but also an auto shop, a produce, so forth and so on, because you can take what you know about a present super Walmart and apply it to the new super Walmart. When you're looking at a lot of the situations that you'll come across in algebra, for example, it's more or less going to be deductive reasoning in that you will have some sort of property or law given to you, and you can put in any numbers. The mathematician has already calculated the inductive work for you. Now, A could be 4 or 44, B could be 7 or 77, C could be 8 or 88. It doesn't matter. You can deduce from there because the property or law has been put in place. So you could try to induce whether or not the ball you throw up in the air is going to fall back down by coming up with a hypothesis saying it's going to stay in the air, for example, and throw it up 5 times and find out it falls down 5 times. Or you could deduce this by simply saying Newton's law of gravity says that what goes up must fall down. So you're taking something that's already been established and applying it to the specific object, the ball. So deduction essentially is used in algebra. It can be used in science. We can also do inductive things in science as well if you're coming up with your own formula and so forth. So I'll move on to how we're going to be using this in the humanities and with argumentative writing. I mentioned the syllogism. I'll start with the easiest one. Really, Socrates came up with this initially. I'll modernize it and put John in there for you. A syllogism is an argument in 3 parts. You have your major premise, your minor premise, and your conclusion. The major premise, all humans are mortal. The minor premise, John is a human. And the conclusion, John is mortal. Well, we know that we all are mortal creatures, so if John is a human, then he also will be a mortal creature. That syllogism is sound because it all logically falls from each part. So A equals B, B equals C, then A and C have to work. This works well for facts. When you get into complex arguments, then it's a little fuzzier because there's some debate on whether or not we agree with the major premise, whether or not we agree with the minor premise, so forth and so on. All right, so another simple one. All dogs are animals. Snoopy's a dog, therefore Snoopy is an animal. I guess unless we're talking about the cartoon character and you could say, try to come up with some debate. But essentially, most of us are going to say, okay, we get it. Snoopy's a dog, he's an animal, and that works for us. So when you are looking at a sound deductive syllogism, it has valid form in that it all logically falls down in order. Just because you have a valid form doesn't mean it's true. All cows are purple, Betsy is a cow, therefore Betsy is purple. Not all cows are purple. So on that one, you could go in and attack the major premise. I made this one fairly simple for you. I think most of you know cows aren't purple. However, when you get to these complex, controversial issues, these topics with which there is much debate, oftentimes that major premise, 50% of the country will say, yeah, that's right. And the other 50% will say, no, that's wrong, or probably more likely 30 to 60 or something, and then 10 undecided and so forth. You get it. But in any case, there is disagreement, enough so that some people claim cows most certainly are purple, even if all of the evidence says otherwise. All right. Do some practice. All men are mortal. Lisa's not a man. She is a woman. Therefore, Lisa is not mortal. She is immortal. You could ask yourself what's ambiguous. Obviously, the term men is being used for humans. That could be fixed so easily. Just change it to humans, and then you can say, hey, we're all mortal. The next one is a little more complicated. Killing an innocent human being is murder. Abortion kills an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is murder. All the pro-life people are going to say, yeah, that's right. And Roe versus Wade is probably about ready to get either dismantled or overturned with the new Supreme Court justice. So they may end up getting this one. But if you have a pro-choice person, or I think most polls say around 67% of the population here in the US, they're going to have some problems with this. They're going to look at terms like innocent human being and say, just because it's a fertilized egg doesn't mean it has all the same constitutional rights as a walking, talking human being, or that it could even survive out of the womb at that moment. So they're going to debate what you mean by innocent human being, and it becomes a definition of terms as much as anything else, and people don't agree about the terminology, to be sure. So, along with having a valid form, all the terminology has to be agreed upon, or you start arguing about the terms and rhetoric and semantics as much so as you do about the topic. With the form, it also has to make sure that it's logically carried out. All murderers have ears. All Methodists have ears. All murderers are Methodists. Yes, murderers might have ears. Maybe you have a Van Gogh murderer out there who's cut his ears off. I don't know. But even if you say murderers have ears, if you look at that minor premise, there's a pretty important term for the major premise not there, and that is murderer. So the conclusion is going to be false because you're not carrying down all key terminology. So you have to not only have terminology with which we can agree upon or at least bring up debate, we also have to make sure that you are carrying all key elements down throughout your argument, or you're going to come up with questionable conclusions. When you put it side by side, I think it's easy to see. Everyone who drives 80 miles per hour is breaking the law. Joe is driving 80 miles per hour. Joe is breaking the law. Everyone who drives 80 miles per hour is breaking the law. Kim is breaking the law. Kim is driving at 80 miles per hour. The top one you can see makes sense, whereas the bottom one, well, when you say Kim is breaking the law, she could be doing all sorts of things, stealing or whatnot. It doesn't have to be just driving 80 miles per hour. On the top one, maybe he's an ambulance driver or something that gives him an exception, but for the most part, if he's going 80 miles per hour, most of the places across the country, he'd be going in excess of the speed limit and he'd be breaking the law. So you can see the top one has a valid form, whereas the bottom one has an invalid form. Marriage is a religious institution between a man and a woman. Jane and Susan are both women going in front of a judge. Therefore, Jane and Susan cannot be married. Well, with this one, it comes down to the definition of terms. Marriage is a religious institution between a man and a woman. There are people, Vice President Pence, for example, who would certainly say that is true. As of the time I'm recording this, the Supreme Court has determined that a human being who could be heterosexual or homosexual, who wants to be with someone else, could be joined with that person. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious joining. The religious ceremony can be there, but for that religious ceremony, you have to still have the priest or the pastor or whomever have a license. Again, it doesn't have to be religious ceremony. You could go to the courthouse and have everything signed there. And so what we found with this is that you are really discriminated against certain people by not allowing them to have, some of the same niceties that you would see in marriage. Simple things like if I die, my property goes to my spouse. That could become a big battle with a homosexual couple if the house is in one person's name, that person passes away, the person who's living there wants to keep on living there, the family wants to take the house, so forth and so on, let alone things like health insurance and everything else. So it just makes sense to allow homosexuals the same rights as heterosexuals. And so that's why we're seeing that change towards progress in this country. All college classes should be accessible. Altman says classes are too hard, therefore the college should reimburse students who fail his classes. Some of my students certainly like that, but there are some issues with the syllogism. First of all, if you could really look at the idea of accessibility and question that, I'll pretty much leave that alone because I think everyone should have access to higher education. And I'd be on board with making it more affordable for everybody too, but that's a different story for a different day. I would subsidize it and certainly make it more accessible. But should all classes be like accessible? How are you defining accessibility? Don't you have to have a certain intellect, so forth and so on? So one could argue that. I'm not going to. I'm going to go to the minor premise because there's more issues there. In particular, a very subjective, hard to define term. I just said hard. What makes it difficult? How do you define difficult? How do you define what is hard? That's pretty subjective, and a lot of people could debate that. You need to insert something much more objective to reach a logical conclusion. The KKK opposes hate crime laws. Senator Smith opposes hate crime laws. Therefore, Senator Smith is a member of the KKK. This is much like the one we saw earlier with the murderers and the Methodists. A term that I would think would stand out in that major premise, KKK, has just evaporated and not shown up at all in the minor premise, and then it shows up again in the conclusion. That is a poor form. You have to carry all key terminology down. Senator Smith could very well be an African American himself who actually just says, I don't want any sort of legislation put in place that judges me based upon gender, skin color, so forth and so on. He would not have to be a member of the KKK. So you must carry down all key terminology. And here's the last one. The reason that standardized test scores are falling is because of poor teachers in schools. That's me, I guess. The No Child Left Behind Act consequences to school and teachers for low test scores. Therefore, standardized test scores will be on the rise. One could look at that major premise and say it's post hoc ergo propter hoc, and that's how I would probably try to attack this particular syllogism. The reason standardized test scores are falling is because of poor teachers and schools. Well, that's what the No Child Left Behind Act did. It took money away from schools that had lower test scores. So I guess the idea was basically we're going to be able to set up voucher programs and so forth for private schools, which is another story for another day. But their idea essentially was if you're going to be put on that watch list, then the next step is going to have funding taken away, and the next step will be to remove teachers, so forth and so on. And that's going to fix the schools, and the schools certainly must be bad because the teachers aren't teaching you. But there are a plethora of other reasons as to why standardized test scores are going down, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the teachers themselves. For one thing, teachers are certainly motivators and important to learning, but parents, socioeconomic class, student interest, student intrinsic motivation, many other things, our culture as a whole, and all the battles that can get in the way within our culture certainly play a role, as well as the teachers themselves. Hey, not that there aren't some poor teachers and there aren't some good teachers, not that there aren't some schools that perform better and schools that don't perform as well, but you can't say that is the only thing. So it's post hoc or propter hoc, and that is how I'd attack that major premise. So I hope you have a little bit of a better understanding of how you would use deduction when we get into our argumentative papers. Essentially, if you can attack a major premise, you're going to want to do that. If you can show that the minor premise doesn't lead logically from the major premise, you're going to want to do that. If you can show that terminology needs to be defined better in order to have a reasoned argument, you're going to want to do that. Thank you for watching this presentation or listening, and I look forward to reading some of your papers.